we come to the next letter of Elisa on page 75. The next letter spoke only of the birth of her niece, whose godmother she was to be, of Juliet's joy and of my uncle's, but of her own feelings there was no further question. So we have this information that Juliet's daughter, who would also be named Elisa, she will have Elisa as her godmother. In a later letter, Elisa writes, Juliet seems very happy. I was grieved at first to find that she had given up her piano and her reading. But Edward Tessier does not like music and hasn't much taste for books. No doubt Juliet is acting wisely in not seeking her pleasure where he cannot follow her. So we see the difference that earlier Juliet took credit in the fact that she could recite poems or read from books or quote from memory, as well as Elisa or Jerome. She wanted to do that because she knew that Jerome liked it. So she was taking pleasure in reading and things which was liked by Jerome because she loved Jerome. But now that her husband does not like all these things, so she readily gives them up and even begins to take interest in his business. On the other hand, she takes an interest in her husband's occupations and he tells her all about his business. So in this fashion, Juliet is gradually moving away from the influence of Jerome. She also writes that now her father is much better. The sight of his daughter's happiness has made him young again. So yes, on the earlier page where Elisa writes about Juliet being better again, she deliberates on happiness. This that we call happiness, how intimate a part of the soul it is, and of what little importance are the outside elements which seem to go to its making. I spare you all the reflections I make during my walks along the garrigue, when what astonishes me the most is that I don't feel happier. Juliet's happiness ought to fill me with joy. Why does my heart give way to an incomprehensibly melancholy against which I am unable to fight? The very beauty of the country, which I feel, which at any rate I recognize, adds still further to this inexplicable sadness. When you wrote to me from Italy, I was able to see everything through you. Now I feel as if I were depriving you of whatever I look at without you. So in these expressions we find that even though Elisa theorizes that she should be happy because her sister is now happy in her marriage, yet she feels this melancholy at heart, which is probably the result of the frustration in her own love or in her affair with Jerome. But as Jerome said that Elisa now speaks of her own feelings rarely, less frequently, which suggests a distance that is growing between the two of them. Then by the time this chapter ends, the correspondence between Jerome and Elisa also ends, which is an indication that they have become a little distant from each other and the line of communication is now interrupted or would be interrupted for a long time. And Elisa writes on page 76, "This is my last letter, my friend. However uncertain the date of your return may be, it cannot be delayed much longer. I shall not be able to write to you any more. I should have preferred our meeting to have been at Fonguzmar, but the weather has broken. It is very cold and father talks of nothing but going back to town. Now that Juliet and Robert are no longer with us, we could easily take you in, but it is better that you should go to Aunt Felicie, who will be glad to have you." So she is kind of apprehensive of the meeting that is finally going to happen between her and Jerome, and she says that I will stop writing now. As the day of our meeting comes near, I look forward to it with growing anxiety, almost with apprehension. I seem now to dread your coming that I so longed for. I try not to think of it. I imagine your ring at the bell, your step on the stairs, and my heart stops beating or hurts me. And whatever you do, don't expect me to be able to speak to you. I feel my past comes to an end here. I see nothing beyond. My life stops. Thus, these lines, written in passion, no doubt, indicate that Alyssa won't be able even to speak to Jerome when they meet. And why so? Because she perhaps feels alienated from him, or she feels that there is too much to speak about and that they have been separated for too long, and now to bridge this gap would be overwhelming. So whatever the reason, she feels that she won't be able to communicate with Jerome when they would meet. And then 4 days later, a week before Jerome was freed from military service, she receives one more letter. My friend, I entirely approve of your not wanting to prolong beyond measure your stay at Le Havre and the time of our first meeting. What should we have to say to each other that we have not already written? So if the business connected with your examination calls you to Paris as early as the 28th, don't hesitate. Don't even regret that you are not able to give us more than 2 days. Shall we not have all our lives? So in these lines, we see a fear in Alyssa of meeting Jerome. And she wants him to leave early, go back to Paris early, and not stay here in Le Havre more than 2 days. But her protestations about their continuous communication with each other, their speaking to each other, their communication through letters, that there was no separation between them, and that they have said everything to each other, and that they have the whole lives to themselves. All these assurances and words of comfort, they are attempts to make believe, because she herself does not believe in them. So she tries to believe herself and to make Jerome believe also that there is no gap between them, that they enjoy full confidence in each other and they have full communication, which is actually not there. To some extent, Jerome feels this distance growing between them, but Alyssa appears to be lost, and she does not want or she doesn't know how to bridge the gap once again. In the next chapter, chapter 6, we see they are going to meet, but Aunt Plotier is always there between them. The first meeting took place at Aunt Plotier's house. I suddenly felt that my military service had made me heavy and clumsy. Later on I thought she must have found me altered. But why should this first deceptive impression have had any importance for us too? As for me, I was so much afraid of not recognizing the Alyssa I knew that at first I hardly dared look at her. No, what was really embarrassing was the absurd position of being engaged, which they all forced upon us, and everybody's anxiety to leave us alone and hurry away when we were there. So people wanted them to be engaged and wanted them to speak to each other, but they were constantly avoiding frank communication with each other. So when Aunt finds herself with the two of them, she wants to remove herself and says that I know that young people, when they meet after many days, they have a lot to speak to each other. Oh, aunt, you are not in the least in the way. We have nothing private to say to each other, cried Alice at last, impatient at the tactless manner in which the excellent woman tried to efface herself. Yes, yes, my dear, I quite understand. When young people haven't seen each other for a long time, they always have lots of little things to tell each other. So the aunt was trying to be understanding, but actually she was very obtrusive. She was always present, wherever they were, whenever they were with each other. Somehow the aunt was also there. So we see that both Alisa and Jerome, they are in modes of denial. And Alisa won't accept that the presence of aunt, causes any problem for them. I arrived long before luncheon time. I found Alisa talking to a girlfriend whom she had not the strength of mind to send away and who was not discreet enough to go. So there was always somebody else, and the two of them never find an opportunity to freely speak to each other. At last she left us. I pretended to be surprised that Alisa had not kept her to lunch. So you see how hypocritical they are. So Jerome wanted this girl to leave. When she left, then he said that why didn't you invite her to lunch? We were both of us in a state of nervous tension and tired by a sleepless night. My uncle appeared. Alisa felt that I thought him aged. He had grown rather deaf and heard my voice with difficulty. The necessity I was under of shouting so as to make myself understood made my talk dull and stupid. So Jerome's experience was not at all happy at the aunt's place. The uncle had grown deaf and he had to shout. So he felt that he could not say anything subtle or anything intelligent in this manner. Then the two of them hold hands. But after holding their hands for some time, whether it is because of summer or the heat, after some time they feel uncomfortable and they let their hands go. My head was aching so badly that I could not extract a single idea from it to keep myself in countenance, or because I thought that the gesture might serve instead of words. I had taken Alisa's hand, which she let me keep. Our emotion, the rapidity of our walk and the awkwardness of our silence sent the blood to our faces. So both of them were over-conscious, extremely conscious of their purpose of meeting, and they were kind of secretly ashamed of it, and because of the long separation, now they felt this meeting to be very embarrassing. Alisa's color was, I felt my temples throbbing. Alisa's color was unpleasantly heightened, and soon the discomfort of feeling the contact of our damp hands made us unclasp them and let them drop sadly to our sides. So you see, this is how this meeting, which was supposed to be momentous after a separation of more than a year, took place, and how unsatisfactory this meeting was. Then they are supposed to go on a walk, and the aunt was on her carriage, and the aunt brings them to a particular point from where they get down from the carriage, and after walking for some time together, then the aunt is supposed to pick them up again. But the whole thing happened in such a way that it was they could not make much of the meeting or the opportunity. But the worst was again the pressing solicitude of our poor aunt, who was convinced that we had a long and satisfactory talk and was longing to question us about our engagement. So what would they say about engagement? They couldn't say anything. Alice, unable to bear it and with her eyes full of tears, alleged a violent headache, and we drove home in silence. The next day I woke up with aching limbs and a bad chill, so unwell that I put off going to the book class till the afternoon. Now, as we will learn later, that this was a wrong decision by Jerome. He didn't go in the morning, he went in the afternoon. But we will learn later that Elisa had waited the whole morning for Jerome and missed him. And when Jerome went in the afternoon, then she was too busy with other guests. So there was this character, Madeleine Plothier, one of Aunt Felicie's granddaughters, and she wanted to go with Jerome when Jerome set out for Elisa's place. I agreed mechanically. She asked him, if you are going back to the court when you leave here, we might as well go together. I agreed mechanically so that I was unable to see Elisa alone, but the presence of this charming girl was no doubt a help to us. I had the impression that she had not understood till that moment that I was going away the next morning, that is Elisa. But the prospect of my speedy return took away any touch of tragedy from my goodbye. Then Jerome left the next morning. So we can see that they had hardly any meaningful conversation or any decision taken on their engagement. They were so embarrassed and shy and nervous about their meeting and their long waiting, that when the opportune moment of meeting came, then they could not take any action at all, or they could not even exchange their ideas. Jerome goes back to Paris and receives this letter from Elisa. My friend, what a melancholy meeting. You seem to lay the blame on other people, but without being able to convince yourself. And now I think I know it will be so always. Oh, I beg of you, don't let us see each other again. So Elisa's impression was that other people are not to be blamed for their unhappy meeting. There was something in Jerome that he did not take the initiative of a fruitful conversation and engagement. So here we do not see Jerome taking any initiative. He appears to be waiting, always waiting for Elisa to take the initiative. Why this awkwardness, this feeling of being in a false position, this paralysis, this dumbness, when we have everything in the world to say to each other? The first day of your return, this very silence made me happy because I believed it would vanish and that you would tell me the most wonderful things. It was impossible that you should leave me without. But when our lugubrious expedition to Orchard came to an end without a word, when above all our hands unclasped and fell apart so hopelessly, I thought my heart would have fainted within me for grief and pain. So Elisa didn't expect that Jerome would behave so oddly, that he would not, speak about the engagement, or that he would not initiate the conversation and so on. So the silence between them, which Elisa initially appreciated, the ice was never broken. And for that, I suppose that Jerome cannot be entirely blamed, because when earlier Jerome had taken initiatives or even proposed to her, she always rejected him for one reason or other. Therefore, now if Jerome develops some kind of an inhibition and does not propose to her again or fix the engagement, we cannot totally blame him. And Elisa also always speaks of, she always told Jerome not to come to Franc-Gismar, not to disturb Juliet, so on and so forth. So she cited various reasons for not meeting and for not, communicating with each other, prolonging their waiting. And from this letter we learn that the next morning when Jerome decided not to go, that he would go in the evening. The next day, yesterday, I expected you madly all the morning. I was too restless to stop indoors, and I left a line for you to tell you where to find me on the jetty. I stayed a long time looking at the stormy sea, but I was too miserable looking at it without you. I imagined suddenly that you were waiting for me in my room and went in. I knew I wouldn't be free in the afternoon. Madeleine had told me the day before that she meant to come, and as I expected to see you in the morning, I didn't put her off. So there was this kind of misunderstanding between them. So they just assumed, Elisa assumed that Jerome would come in the morning, but did not verify or confirm it with him. And Jerome did not bother much. He just decided without confirming with Elisa that he won't go in the morning. You had no sooner left with Madeleine, that is, we remember how unceremoniously Jerome bid goodbye, telling Elisa that he was leaving the next morning, and he even was not sure that Elisa properly understood it. Then it struck me as impossible, unbearable. Will you believe it? I went out. I wanted to speak to you again, to tell you all the things I had not told you. I was already hurrying to the Clotier. It was late. I didn't have time, didn't dare. I came in again, desperate to write to you, that I didn't want to write to you anymore. So Elisa was in a state of agitation after Jerome had left, and she wanted to speak to him, but since he was not there, so she decided to write to him, but she thought that she was angry, so she didn't want to write to him. So she was full of contradictions, that I didn't want to write to you anymore. A goodbye letter because I felt too much that our correspondence was nothing but a vast mirage. That we were each writing, alas, only to ourselves, and that, Jerome, how far apart we were all the time. So Elisa realizes that this distance has grown between them, and they were writing probably to themselves, that is, not to each other. Therefore, this correspondence didn't much help them. This correspondence didn't help in reducing the distance between them. So Jerome found this letter very painful, but after that he receives another letter, she adds in the postscript, I do not wish to let this letter go without asking you to show a little more discretion in regard to what concerns us both. Many a time you have wounded me by talking to Juliet or Abel about things which should have remained private between you and me. And this is indeed what made me think, long before you suspected it, that your love was above all intellectual, the beautiful tenacity of a tender, faithful man. So Elisa in fact blames Jerome for indiscretion, that Jerome had often spoken of his love with Elisa to Abel or to somebody else, Juliet, which she thought of as some kind of a betrayal, that Jerome should not have spoken about this to others. And Elisa began to think that Jerome was some kind of a dispassionate lover, that is, his love was more intellectual than physical. So she describes it as the beautiful tenacity of a tender, faithful mind. She accepts that Jerome has a tender, faithful mind, but that's it. His love is not that strong, desire for uniting with her, but it was an intellectual kind of love. So we realized that this would hurt Jerome a lot, because much of what Elisa writes was unjustified, and Elisa tends to blame Jerome for the distance or the coldness between them in their relationship, but as we can see that she is not any less to blame, if not more, for this distance growing between them. Jerome writes a letter saying that have pity on me, you are torturing me, writing in this manner, and expresses his love, or once again protests that he still loves her. I love you too much to be skillful, and the more I love you, the less I know what to say to you. Intellectual love, what am I to answer to that? When it is with my whole soul that I love you, how can I distinguish between my intellect and my heart? But since your correspondence is the cause of your unkind imputation, since we have been so grievously hurt by our fall into reality from the heights to which that correspondence had raised us, since if you were to write to me now, you would think that you are writing only to yourself, since too I have not strength to bear another letter like your last, please for a time let us stop all communication. So we see that stopping communication is not a solution where people need more communication. But Jerome actually becomes afraid of being hurt by Elisa's comment more in the future. So he wants to prevent it, and therefore he wants to stop all correspondence, communication. And after that, there will be another meeting with Elisa, which will be there in chapter 7. But here the narration continues. I was to see Elisa once more before the end of the year. Miss Ashburton, whose health had been declining for some months past, died 4 days before Christmas. On my return from my military service, I had gone back to stay with her. I left her very little and was present at her last moments. So this was very kind of Jerome to be with Miss Ashburton. A card from Elisa showed me that our vow of silence lay nearer her heart than my bereavement. So even after this bereavement, that is when Flora Ashburton dies, Elisa does not write to him. She would come up, she said, for the day just to go for the funeral, which my uncle would not be able to attend. She and I were almost the only mourners to be present at the burial service and afterwards to follow the coffin. We walked side by side and exchanged barely a few sentences. But in church, where she took her seat beside me, I several times felt her eyes resting tenderly upon me. So they have a very melancholy meeting at the funeral, but this is not the meeting that we are talking about. That meeting will take place in chapter 7. But this meeting at the funeral, they hardly speak to each other, but they just agree to meet. It is agreed nothing before Easter. No, but at Easter I will expect you. So Elisa does not let him finish and decide that they would meet at Easter. We were at the gate of the cemetery. I suggested taking her to the station, where she called a cab and without a word of farewell left me. So we see that still the ice was not broken, and Elisa and Jerome, they could not speak freely. In the next chapter, when Jerome comes finally to meet Elisa, and then we see that Elisa is in two minds, whether to continue with this talk of engagement with Jerome or not. And she tells him that if she wears the amethyst cross which Jerome had given her, then that would be a sign that Jerome can stay on. But if she doesn't wear the cross, that would be a sign that Jerome must leave the next morning, which means that there would be no further conversation between them on that any matter. And as it would happen, Elisa would appear without the amethyst cross, and Jerome, like a true gentleman, immediately left. So you can see that there is something ridiculous about this, that Jerome even agreed to such a proposal and did not persuade Elisa to change her mind. So when he saw that she was not wearing the cross, he just left. Thus the amethyst cross appears here as a symbol of Elisa's acceptance of Jerome and their companionship. But it is a cross. So it also has the symbolism of agony, of pain, and Elisa would not wear it, and that would lead to Jerome's agony. Elisa is waiting for you in the garden, said my uncle, after having embraced me paternally, when one day at the end of April I arrived at Fongismar. If at first I was disappointed at not finding her ready to welcome me, the next moment I was grateful that she had spared us both the first commonplace greetings. She was at the bottom of the garden. I made my way to the place at the head of the steps, where at this time of year the shrubs that set it closely round were all in flower. Lilacs, rowan trees, laburnums and vegelias. In order not to catch sight of her from too far, or so that she should not see me coming, I took the other side of the garden along the shady path, where the air was cool beneath the branches. I advanced slowly. The sky was like my joy, warm, bright, delicate and pure. No doubt she was expecting me by the other path. I was close to her, behind her. Before she heard me, I stopped, and as if time could have stopped with me. This is the moment, thought I, the most delicious moment, perhaps of all, even though it should precede happiness itself, which happiness itself will not equal. The moment of expectation is perhaps a better moment than the moment of union. I meant to fall on my knees before her. I took a step which she heard. She got up suddenly, letting the embroidery at which she was working roll to the ground. She stretched out her arm towards me, put her hands on my shoulders. For a few moments we stayed so, with her arms outstretched, her face smiling and bent towards me, looking at me tenderly without speaking. She was dressed all in white. On her grave face, almost too grave, I recognized her childhood smile. So this meeting, as it appears to be a happy meeting, this has some nostalgic quality about it, because Jerome recognizes in Elisa her childhood smile, the smile which had almost disappeared from her face, since they were childhood friends. So when Jerome looks at her face, he recognizes this smile, which means that momentarily they went back to their childhood, which was much better than the present days. It is a nostalgic trip in memory. Listen, Elisa, I cried suddenly. I have 12 days before me. I will not stay one more than you please. Let us settle on a sign which shall mean, tomorrow you must leave Fongismar. Jerome proposes this. The next day I will go without recrimination, without complaint. Do you agree? So what would you make of this suggestion by Jerome? That there should be a sign which would indicate whether Elisa is agreeable to the engagement and whether she wants Jerome to stay on, or she wants him to leave. And Jerome would do accordingly. It appears to be a fair proposal. Jerome gives Elisa all the space that she needs, all the freedom to reject him once again. It is very democratic perhaps, but this is not how love works, because love makes demands. Jerome does not make any demands on Elisa. He is always willing to yield to her, her rejection or her postponement of meeting and so on. He always yields to Elisa's proposals. He does not object to them, he doesn't fight, he does not make demands on Elisa, nothing. Therefore we may say that Jerome is a strange lover. Is he a true lover? The author tells us repeatedly that Jerome is a true lover and that Jerome remains constant in his love, even after Elisa's death. But what would we say about this? Why is Jerome so inhibited in his love? There is no other plausible reason than the influence of Jansenism. So we may say that in this novel, Gide has represented the way ideology can work on young people, on their minds, and sometimes stifle them. So the philosophical, religious ideas of Jansenism, they are not very conducive for any true love relationship. Because of these religious ideas and the constant sublimation of love into a higher spiritual, category, that we find Jerome and Elisa, they come to accept these so-called higher spiritual ideals, and they reject all that is normal, natural, and all that is supposed to happen between two lovers. So there is repression at work. They repress their instincts, they repress their desire, they form false images about themselves. They become captive to these false images. They cannot come out of their shells. And in the name of religion, they ultimately reject life. She reflected a moment, then says, "The evening that I come down to dinner without wearing the amethyst cross you like, will you understand? That is to be my last evening. But will you be able to go without a tear or a sigh? Without a goodbye, I will leave you on that last evening exactly as I shall have done the evening before, so simply that you will wonder whether I have understood. But when you look for me the next morning, I shall just not be there." So Jerome takes pride in this agreement, where he would behave like a gentleman and be true to his words. He would leave without a word or a sigh. Is Elisa happy with this? Of course not. Elisa would have expected Jerome to protest and, but Jerome turns out to be different. And why does Elisa not persuade him not to reject life, not to reject true love? Because she herself believed that she should help Jerome becoming a saint. as only one person could, go through that straight gate, that narrow gate. So in her imagination she thought that two people could not go through it. So Jerome and Elisa cannot be together. At some point they must separate. And Elisa thought that Jerome would walk the path of virtue and go to heaven. This is all due to the influence of Jansenist thought and the sublimation of desire by religious ideas. I should so much like, I went on, that these few days with you should seem like other days. I mean that we should not feel, either of us, that they are exceptional. And then if we are not to try too hard to talk just at first. She began to laugh. I added, isn't there anything we could do together? So, if they cannot talk, then they must at least do something together. And Jerome thought of gardening. In this way we once more grew accustomed to one another. It was on this familiarity that I counted rather than on any actual explanation. The very recollection of our separation was already beginning to disappear from between us, and the fearfulness which I used to feel in her, the tension of spirit which she used to fear in me, were already beginning to grow less. So they were again coming close. Elisa seemed younger than during my melancholy visit of the autumn, and I had never thought her prettier. I had not yet kissed her. Every evening I saw sparkling on her bodice the little amethyst cross, which she wore hanging from a gold chain round her neck. Hope sprang up again confidently in my breast. Hope, do I say? No. It was already a certainty, and I thought I felt it too in Elisa, for I was so little doubtful of myself that I could no longer have any doubts of her. Little by little our talks grew bolder. So everything appears to be favoring the engagement. I spoke slowly with my eyes fixed upon her. Okay, so now Jerome once again proposes to Elisa, and Elisa will once again reject him. Elisa, I said to her one morning when all the air breathed laughter and delight and our hearts were opening like the flowers, now that Juliet is happy, won't you let us too? I spoke slowly with my eyes fixed upon her. On a sudden she turned pale, so extraordinarily that I could not finish my sentence. Dear, she began, without turning her eyes towards me, I feel happier with you than I thought it was possible to feel. But believe me, we are not born for happiness. Now from where does this, pessimism appear, or this melancholy appear? Who told her that happiness was not for them? They were not born for happiness. So Elisa places something over happiness in her scale of values. And what is that thing? For her, it would be more desirable that Jerome would become a saint, and she should be able to help him in that process. She should not be a hindrance or an obstacle, but a help in that process. To this idea, she sacrifices happiness. Again, we see here the desire to sacrifice one's happiness for somebody else. So earlier we saw that for Julia's happiness she was sacrificing Jerome as a lover, and she was sacrificing her happiness. And now we see that she wants to sacrifice her happiness so that Jerome can become a saint and get that happiness which is much more valuable, the union with God, which is much more valuable than the union with an earthly lover. What can the soul prefer to happiness? I cried impetuously. She whispered, holiness, so low that I divined rather than heard the word. So she was putting holiness above happiness. She wanted Jerome to be holy rather than happy, and she herself wanted to help Jerome in this holiness. Therefore, we see that Jerome had no inkling how far Elisa was influenced by religious thought. He himself liked religious literature or practiced religion, but he never imagined that anything is there beyond happiness. So he was looking for happiness from Elisa. But now Elisa proposes this idea of holiness as a value which is beyond happiness. My whole happiness spread its wings and flew away out of my heart and up to heaven. So Jerome is once again forced to look at heaven, and happiness goes away. I cannot reach it without you, I said, and with my head on her knees weeping like a child, but for love, not for grief. I repeated again and again, not without you, not without you. Jerome accepted the argument that yes, holiness is above happiness. But he said that I do not imagine a heaven where you are not there. So I cannot go to heaven without you. But Elisa imagined that only one person can go to heaven. The strait gate will not allow two persons. That is, the path of virtue is very narrow. Then in a letter the following day, Elisa quotes from Twelfth Night, Shakespeare's play. That strain again, it had a dying fall. Oh, it came over my ear like the sweet sound that breathes upon a bank of violets, stealing and giving odor. Enough, no more. It is not so sweet now as it was before. This reference to Shakespeare suggests the pan-European context in which Gide writes his novels. So the flimsiness, the transient moods of a lover, which finds expression in the dew in this play, Twelfth Night. So what was sweeter earlier may not appear sweet later. That is the import of these quotations. So in this letter, Elisa justifies her statement by saying that I expressed the most violent feeling of my soul, and it is not any scholastic subtlety. You should not misunderstand me that I am proposing holiness over happiness in a scholastic manner. It is not that. It is my emotion. My emotion goes with it that holiness is superior to happiness. I am afraid, my friend, lest you should misunderstand me. Above all, I am afraid lest you should take for subtlety, oh how mistaken a subtlety, what is merely the expression of the most violent feeling of my soul. If it did not suffice, it would not be happiness, you said. You remember? And I did not know what to answer. No, Jerome, it does not suffice us. Happiness does not suffice us. That is, we need something more beyond happiness. That is holiness. Jerome, it must not suffice us. I cannot take this delicious contentment for the true one. So delicious, pleasant happiness. Happiness that is pleasant, and happiness that may appear to be unpleasant, but that is true happiness. It is the happiness to be united with God, the spiritual happiness. Did we not realize last autumn what misery it covered over? The true one, God forbid, we were born for a happiness other than that. God forbid that we were born for any happiness than the true happiness. The true happiness lies in spirituality. So Elisa refers to the last autumn where they felt the ups and downs in their relationship, and even their meeting turned out to be unsatisfactory. Therefore, she suggests that in earthly union, in earthly happiness, earthly union of lovers, there is no true happiness. Sometimes melancholy masquerades as happiness, or if you scratch below the skin, then you can see that there is no true happiness. But that is not the case with holiness or superior happiness that can be found in spirituality. That is Elisa's argument here. Right, I will stop here. If you have any questions, you can ask me.